she currently is working on a book on nuclear disarmament of Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, I want to give an early advertisement. I think Dr. Budjeryn is going to be running something on the 25th anniversary of the Budapest Protocol up at Harvard. I know we will help in that effort. And it's very important for us to remember that, because we think that if Crimea, as I understand it, if Crimea is Ukrainian, it will be nuclear free. If Crimea is not Ukrainian, if it becomes Russian, it can become triadically nuclear, both land, sea, and air capabilities on Crimean soil. So that'll be an important thing. She has previously held fellowships at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the European International Security Program project managing before. So, in effect, Dr. Budjeryn, it's all yours, and I know this is going to be a very, very good.
Is this on? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Zaryckyj, for, as always, organizing an excellent event and attracting very interesting people for a very timely discussion. I'll start our session today with a bit of a background and a bit of an anecdote. As a grad student at the Central European University in Budapest in 2009, 2013, a lot of my training in security studies has been sort of these issues of energy security, of human security, of identity security. In Europe, it seemed that at the time, questions of hard security were such a thing of the past. Right? Cold War was over. Old arms control hawks were dinosaurs. Now we're talking about migration. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about very, very important issues. But I think what all of us in the field realized, that nobody canceled hard security, that in 2014, hard security questions of military, of hardware, of air, land, naval defenses, and warfare were back on the agenda in a very, very important way. So today we're going to talk on this panel about military, about hard security, and about what it means for Ukraine going forward. Ukraine had inherited, as most of you know, this giant army from the Soviet Union, lots of tanks, lots of aircraft, about 1 million men under arms. But all of this military, all of these military assets were designed by a different state for a different strategic purpose. And from 1991 on, Ukraine had struggled to reform, to reshape its defenses and its military to suit its new strategic situation. So today with us we have two excellent experts to discuss things, the topics of military security. We have Leonid Polyakov, who's an Afghan veteran, as many of you know, who had worked for the general staff in Ukraine, who had advised the Council of National Security, had been the Deputy Minister of Defense in Ukraine, and probably more than anyone is qualified to discuss how Ukraine, what kind of job Ukraine has done so far in reshaping its military to suit its strategic purposes and to suit its defenses, and what kind of job Ukraine should be doing in air, on land, and at sea. We also have here Dr. Stephen Blank, who is bar none one of the top experts on Russia, Eurasia, on military and security policy in that type of the world. He had been a professor at the US Army College and taught many courses, authored numerous books and articles. And of course, I'm hoping Dr. Blank will give us a view from the outside, from perhaps the viewpoint of a Ukrainian ally and partner, NATO and the United States, as to what could make Ukraine that kind of military partner, what could make Ukraine an attractive kind of a contribution, perhaps, to a military, what Ukraine needs to do to get there. And without further ado, I will pass probably first to Leonid, and then to Dr. Blank.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Before proceeding to my presentation, I would like to say two important things. One is more positive and another is less. In terms of positive, I feel very grateful to US-Ukraine Foundation for convening us and continuously for many years doing this great job of strategic communication. So thank you, Nadia McConnell, Volodko, Mikola, Andriy, and Jan Talens, and all people who care about Ukraine here in the strong democratic country, United States. Because the previous government was not good in strategic communication, and unfortunately I see that the new government is not much better, and maybe even worse. So you do a great job, thank you. The second important thing I want to say is connected to the question to the previous speakers about willingness of Russian soldiers to fight. I agree with their remarks with regard to soldiers, but we have to remember that it is not necessarily that Russia will attack with raw infantry. As experience of Syria, Chechnya, the conflicts proved, it's quite possible they will start with ground-based missiles, Iskander, sea-based cruise missiles, Caliber, airborne missiles, not even crossing the border of Ukraine. And with all that weaponry, they can inflict really big damage, not caring about civilian casualties and killing a lot of targets of Ukraine armed forces and political and economic, which are not movable, not maneuverable, I would say, So I'm less pessimistic about the possibility of Russia to attack Ukraine. Now about my vision of military security matters and optimal land defenses, optimal naval and air defense. As soon as military is secondary to politics, the major factor in this military security is the fact that independent and democratic Ukraine, for imperial chauvinistic Russia, will always be an object of aggression. And to prevent this, there is no other way than strengthening defense to the level that will allow to cause unacceptable losses to the enemy. This truism is rather common for Ukrainian and foreign experts. Ambassador John Herbst, just 1 month ago, together with Nadia McConnell, was speaking at Diplomatic Academy in Ukraine, and he said that our primary objective is to strengthen Ukraine's deterrence by raising the cost of future Russian aggression. General Breedlove at the same event has strongly supported the statement. The question then comes, is Ukraine capable to do it? To stop possible armed assault by Russian armed forces, or better to contain, to prevent, to deter Russians from this armed assault? I think in general, yes, Ukraine can do it. naturally, the next question comes with the word however. However, at the moment, the positive answer depends on too many different factors. Political will, citizens' will, economic strength, allied support, civil defense, mobilization potential, military readiness, maneuverability, lethality, intelligence, territorial defense. Too many variables at the moment which still need to be stabilized in order to provide a positive answer. So before going into the details on optimal land, air, and naval defenses, let's consider a bit the general basic military strategic context. The key factor of the current military security context for Ukraine is Ukraine finally recognized that it has a real enemy. When I was dealing with defense planning back 10, 15 years ago, it was not the case. Politically, at least. For me it was, but for politicians, no. And having the real enemy allowed for more realistic threat assessment, you heard from Mr. Green, better defense planning, more relevant combat training, and triple increase in defense budget from 2014. If the promise by the Prime Minister Honcharuk for 136 billion hryvnia for the next defense budget is kept, he made it just a few days ago, then it will be close to quadruple increase in defense budget. However, it will still be 4 times smaller than the budget of the neighboring Poland, which has not 250,000, but just 150,000 strong military, and is not fighting a war. 5 years of combat action resulted in tens of thousands of combat hardened reserve personnel, hundreds of experienced commanding and staff, generals and officers, improved weapon systems, creation of territorial defense, and some other positive things. Ukrainian women, which promised to come to this event, by the way, I don't see them yet, who want to serve in the military, received much broader opportunities than before the war in terms of legislation and other support. Ukrainian volunteer fighters and volunteer supporters created a unique Ukrainian national phenomenon of parallel people's military red reserve. Defense industry started receiving sizable orders from national military and resources from the state. So it started long overdue transformations. Today, private defense companies in Ukraine provide already over 50% of defense orders. Foreign partners of Ukraine continue to provide material and advisory support. From the US government alone, Ukraine received about 400 pieces of basic platforms and almost 10,000 pieces of different military equipment. This is the context. Sounds kind of positive. As for the optimal land defenses, according to the recent official data, during 2014-19, the armed forces were supplied with about 12,000 basic models of weapons and military equipment. About the same number, 12,000, were restored after combat actions. In addition, 120 new models were introduced into service. Most of it naturally went to the land forces, carrying the major burden of the war. Today, Ukrainian land forces possess much higher combat readiness than the other 2 services, Air Force and Navy. This is obvious given their numbers, equipment, and combat engagement. So one can say that unlike 2014, Ukrainian land forces are combat ready. But they are ready for what? To hold the line of contact with temporarily occupied enclaves. Yes, the fact that there is no more need in volunteer battalions currently on the front line proves that today our land forces are good enough to hold the line of contact with occupied enclaves. Nevertheless, land forces' ability to repel an assault by Russian regular troops, supported by Russian aviation, conventional cruise missiles, and operational tactical missiles like Iskander, is still limited, even with major mobilization in Ukraine. Will they be able in the near future? depends on their ability to improve not only their current, mainly Soviet organization and equipment, but to obtain much higher maneuverability, lethality, and much better protection from the air. Maneuverability is needed mainly in operational terms, on brigade and high level. It means more agile and fast-moving combat platforms than we have now, and transportation devices, more capable engineer units, more different kind of drones, and helicopters ready available. To cope with Russian conventional attack, much higher lethality is needed in all kinds of firepower, both classic, like field artillery and tactical missiles, and new, like attack drones, multiple launch fire throwers, etc. One shall keep eye on the systems coming in the near future, like laser, electromagnetic, and robotic devices. Unfortunately, I have to say that at the moment I don't see much signs in Ukraine thinking about these types of systems, still more about positively concentration on people, it is needed of course, and improving the current more Soviet type of organization rather than doing something fast in terms of modern military, not Soviet one. And this pessimism I see more not in land forces but in naval and air defenses. Comparison of the numbers of Ukrainian and Russian vessels in the Black Sea does not give much hope on successful confrontation in the open sea. The current ratio is about 1 to 10 or even worse in favor of Russian ships. Ukraine has several shipbuilding programs like Gurza, Kentaur, Line, Corvette, and is thinking about modernizing the naval aviation. There are some ideas about obtaining foreign combat ships and submarines, but these ideas traditionally takes too long to implement, like these boats, American boats, for 3 years somehow Ukraine cannot get during the wartime. So ability to confront Russians in the open sea looks rather distant. Today, the main objective realistically for the Navy is coastal defense to prevent the enemy from launching a successful landing operation. For this purpose, Ukraine already has some realistic potential represented by Marines, coastal artillery, improving engineer coastal engineer systems and modern radars, electronic warfare systems, anti-ship missiles like Neptune. Another promising task, the next one, is to secure at least the 12 miles zone of territorial waters. For this purpose, we have small artillery, missile, and torpedo boats, so-called mosquito fleet, which can be quite useful addition to already available marines and coastal artillery. In December 2018, Ukrainian Navy, with the involvement of Western partners, developed and approved a 3-stage Navy development strategy for 2035. I haven't seen it in the open. I'm just not sure how good it is. Among other things, it provides for control of territorial waters by 2025 and the ability to prevent the enemy from acting freely in any area near the territorial waters. As for defenses, it is about two major things. It is about aviation and it is about anti-aircraft forces. Aviation. Some analysts believe that the idea of a mosquito fleet can quite be transferred into the airspace and to strengthen the ground component in the form of a horde of killer robots. In fact, it may make sense to make 1,000 relatively simple killer drones instead of upgrading the obsolete Soviet platforms like MiG-29 and Su-27. Some people talk about buying in the USA all-weather tactical fighters of 4th generation F-15, The task of replacing the Soviet fighter jets was already set by the new Minister of Defense. However, there is no any document yet to provide for the needed system improvements. In the very important area of anti-aircraft forces, in the recent years, some measures were taken, but the only kind of successful news I heard is about modernizing Soviet platform Pechora S-125, which is a good thing, but provokes smiles from me because back 30 years ago, my company was responsible for some areas near Kabul, and one of my platoons had an outpost near to Afghan air defense squadron equipped with Pechora S-125. So you can imagine what we're talking about. So from our American friends, I heard that at least theoretically there is a possibility to get Avengers and Hawk, and maybe in Europe to ask for Roland systems. I'm not an expert in these systems. Difficult to say how good they are for Ukraine case. In conclusion, talking about military security matters, I think it is not enough to talk only about land, navy and air. One should also look at the very ineffective structure of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine Central Office, on expensive and obsolete military education system, on still Soviet culture of personnel management, administration, housing, on corruption in procurement. Positive news are coming mainly from medical service, which was transferred to the General Staff recently, and about recent projects to digitize the defense plan. Back in 2016, RAND Corporation conducted a study on Ukraine's needs of defense security transformations. In the final report, back 3 years ago, it was recommended to change the structure of central office of the ministry, but this recommendation was not introduced yet. Because of the ineffective management in the ministry, improvements, central office, improvements in military security matters overall are very slow. And these improvements, unfortunately, are still limited in terms of the key strategic objective, building deterrence of the Russian military. Moreover, they are related mostly to land forces, leaving the Navy and Air Force far behind, which is very dangerous. Thank you for your attention.
Following up on that optimistic assessment, I want to thank Walter for inviting us here. What Walter doesn't know is that about 25 years ago, when I was a professor at the Army War College, Len was my office mate. Yeah, I was writing on Ukraine then about the nuclear issues, so this is sort of deja vu all over again. It's my favorite philosopher's citizen. If we're going to look at hard security for Ukraine, military security, and do so in the current strategic context, it is necessary for us to understand that context and on that basis continue forward with the activity of planning, as John pointed out. And as General Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. Because circumstances obviously determine what happens. But nonetheless, if you're not thinking about strategy, about objectives, about operations, and so on, then you're going to be in a very bad situation. I want to start with the latest news that I have, build on that foundation, and give some ideas. Because basically I agree with almost everything Len said in terms of capabilities and where reform needs to be. But there are other points that also need to be made here, and I think, and some that need to be further elaborated. First of all, it was reported today that the withdrawal of troops from the front line that was supposed to be part of this process to bring about the Steinmeier formula, whatever anybody thinks that means, failed yesterday. Whether you like that or not, that means it's going to be very difficult for this whole process that seems to have been begun by President Macron and Putin, and which the Ukrainian government signed on to come about. Because for Kiev, this is conditioned on a withdrawal of troops from the front lines, which is sort of a generator to get everything going. Second point, as Len said, an independent Ukraine, particularly a democratic Ukraine, is always a threat to Russia. As a matter of fact, I will tell you, as sitting here as an expert on Russian security, the greatest threat to Russia today is not the United States military, not the Chinese military, it's not NATO, it's not anybody's military. It is what Victor Hugo called an idea with bayonets. In other words, democracy. This is what really drove Putin and his team to invade 5 years ago, and it drives their thinking today because in their view, first of all, to use the Russian phrase, samostoятельная Украина никогда не была и никогда не будет. An independent Ukraine never has been and never will be. They cannot accept the idea of Ukraine as an independent state, let alone a democracy. That's anathema, and I mean that literally. So they're not going to withdraw, and they're not going to stop trying to undermine Ukraine's territorial integrity and, more importantly, its political independence within its boundaries. This means not only is there likely to be a state of tension under the best of circumstances between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, as Sherman Barnett wrote 25 years ago, is the keystone in the arch of European security. Still, today. And Ukraine's security and European security are inextricable. We need to understand that. And it's not just because, as everybody used to say, that if Russia gains Ukraine, it becomes an empire. It's because if Russia is able to prevail here, it will have learned once again that no matter what cost, military means prevails, and is able to use those to achieve its objectives, which is to thwart not only Europe whole and free, but essentially democracy in all the lands on the European continent, not just east of Germany, but everywhere. Because a divided Europe, historically, for the Tsars as well as for the Soviets, and now for Putin, is the condition of Russian security, and as far as Russia is concerned, it never has enough security, period. Furthermore, any assessment of the war in Ukraine has to understand that, as Clausewitz wrote, war is a chameleon. It changes its color and character. This is a multi-domain war. We're talking today primarily about military security. But subsequent panels are going to be talking about issues that are no less important and that are equally inextricable from the military operations underway. And especially if you read Russian military writing, where they talk about the importance of information warfare. Not the way we define it in this country, but the way they define it. Which means essentially a holistic use of all the information capabilities of the state to target other states. That means that it is essential for Ukraine as well to win its information war if it's to win its military war. And that requirement in turn generates a whole series of political and economic outcomes that need to be taken. And I want to give you an example here from my days at the Army War College. I don't remember if this is when you were in the office, but in 1993, we had a Lithuanian delegation. And we were told that the Lithuanian delegation is coming because they want to learn how to set up an Army War College, and particularly a Strategic Studies Institute, which is where we were. So we gave them the usual lecture and all that. And at the end of the lecture, they told us what the real reason was for coming. They liked all this about. They gave me a 20-page document. This is our defense doctrine. What do you think about it? So this was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I came home, I had dinner, I read it, I was up all night writing a 20-page refutation. Because the argument was in 1993, and as Mariana suggested, in those days, dinosaurs like myself were in scarce supply. Nobody thought that, we're going to have problems with Russia again. Or if they are, they're not going to be the old problems. They're going to be, getting democracy in Russia and so on. Their doctrine basically said, Russia is a permanent threat and you have to save us. And that could have been the doctrine for everybody east of Germany in those days. Still is in many respects. And I wrote to them that while I agreed with the assessment that Russia was a threat, because I was already skeptical about Yeltsin's democracy and other things, Washington would accept that. And that if they wanted to get into NATO, which was clearly what they wanted, and the European Union, then it was incumbent upon them to reform their entire military and security operation and westernize it. And the sooner they did that, the better off they would be. And I wrote this out in extensive detail, what needs to be done. And, they got similar advice from other people as well, they and their neighbors, and they went ahead and did it. Ukraine has not yet done this. Even though Ukraine is now saying that NATO is helping them devise the new national security standard, and that Zelensky said we're going to approach the NATO standard, and there have been considerable steps forward under the most adverse of circumstances, which cannot be denied. Fact of the matter is, as Len said, that the situation is still not sufficiently reformed. The Navy is, to be blunt, incapable of defending the coastline and Ukraine's naval interests. We saw that in November last year in the Kerch Strait. It's still true, those ships are still in Baltimore, and the Ukrainian sailors are still training. I hope that by the time my grandchildren are of military age, those ships will be in Ukraine. They're 2 and 3, so don't hold your breath. The fact that, but this is not a laughing matter, because of the danger of amphibious operations, naval blockade, and the usurpation of the right of freedom of the seas, which is a critical American interest. Land defenses have been spoken on by Alexei and Len. I don't have anything more to add. That air defense is equally critical. Information, and it's not just a question of information warfare, propaganda, disinformation, deep fakes, influence operations. It's creating the reconnaissance strike complex that Marshal Ogarkov talked about 40 years ago, and which is now a reality, in Russian weapons, for that matter, in Iranian weapons. You read Tom Friedman yesterday? And certainly in the American and other major militaries, some of the European ones, Israeli, Chinese, and so on. That needs to be done. In other words, Ukraine has to move forward to what war is becoming, not what it was. The threat is not so much tanks. The threat is missiles, electronic warfare, combined with the information and energy operations. And for this, the entire state needs to be reformed, starting with the command leadership, the defense minister, Ukronobrom, general staff, and so on. And this has to be a constant process. It has to be a ferment. They have to approach NATO and NATO standards, as Zelensky has said. And I'm not sure that's being done. Because for 25 years, I've heard wonderful rhetoric from Ukrainian officials who come here and tell us, we're doing this, we're moving forward, and so on. And yet, when you look at the results, it's very much like Victor Chernomyrdin's famous line, we wanted it to come out for the best, but it came out as it always does. That's not good enough. Because Ukraine has to move forward if it's going to recover its sovereignty, its integrity, and what's more, be accepted as part of Europe. And at the same time, the crisis that we have now in the States, as Sean alluded to, impacts Ukraine very adversely. Zelensky, 8 weeks ago, was in Israel. Netanyahu was in Ukraine, talking to Zelensky. And at that meeting, Zelensky said, at least according to his office, that Ukraine will develop in the areas of security and defense following the example of Israel. Well, I hope that's the case. And let me give you an example of what that case is. 1947, the UN votes to partition what is now Israel between Arab, Palestinian, and Jewish or Israeli settlement. All the Arab states don't even declare war, they just pile in starting the next day. The State of Israel is proclaimed in May 1948. It's already under siege or under attack from 6 Arab states. It basically was alone. It got weapons from Russia, from Czechoslovakia, and some help from the United States. But basically it developed its military alone, including democratic control of the military. And it won. 3 or 4 years later, as the country is developing and taking in massive numbers of immigrants, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion begins a massive science and technology program, the results of which you can see now, the startup nation and so on. Probably also begins what most people believe to be the nuclear program. They are desperately seeking support, maybe even alliance from the United States. They don't get it. They're getting weapons from France. They're getting some diplomatic support in 1956 from France and Great Britain and Suez, and then weapons from France up till 1967, and so on. And they basically prevailed in wars all by themselves, with the exception of getting foreign weapons. At the same time, they built a thriving democratic civilian control of the armed forces, which is unique in its own way. It's not ours, but it's still quite visibly democratic. This is the kind of example that Ukraine has to emulate. Because today, what you have is one of the best militaries in the world, acknowledged as such. You have a country that is exporting arms and high-tech all over the world, which is recognized by everybody as a high-tech center, and whose human capital, a lot of it Soviet in origin, is regarded as exemplary. This is what Ukraine can accomplish. The resources are there. The problem is the political will and insight to achieve. And furthermore, Ukraine, at least for the next 18 months, is going to have to learn to do it alone. Because as John Sage said, it cannot afford to get involved in American political activities. And those activities are going to get more and more intense as we get closer to the election, no matter how this crisis plays out. Ukraine is going to be used to some degree as a political football, which is, again, not in its interest, but it has no control over that, because the stakes in this game are so high, and there are people who are desperate to use it for that purpose. It has to clean up its act. It cannot rely on Europe for military support, although it will get economic support if it reforms, like the new IMF tranche that is supposed to come. But it is going to have to learn to defend itself, even as it seeks to maintain excellent relations with all of its major partners and allies in the West, and seeks to upgrade its standards to further integrate into the West. Now, there are a lot of things that Western governments can do. We're going to hear about energy. I have my own ideas on this subject. We've been told 100 times about corruption and reform, and they've got to keep doing that. And let's be honest, we've heard a lot of nice rhetoric, but not a lot has happened since Zelensky's come in. And the Privat Bank issue is still out there, and that's a touchstone of what's going to happen. So, in conclusion, 5 years ago, when we had the invasion, Walter organized a rally here in Lafayette Park, and he dragged me over. And I got up and made a speech where I concluded from a famous quote by Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. But what I said then holds true. And what Nelson said held true then and holds true now for Ukraine. Before the battle, Nelson told his men, and then after the battle, as he's dying, he's told that we've won. Nelson says, England has saved itself by its exertions and Europe by its example. Whether Ukraine likes it or not. That's the fate that it's been dealt to it. And if Ukraine is to save itself, it will be largely through its own exertions. But by doing so, it will save Europe by its example. Thank you.
Steve, when you talk about corruption, please don't look at me. So.
I look at Len for validation.
I'm not responsible.
No. I look at Len for validation.
Thank you so much. This was super interesting. Questions from the floor? Both Harvard.
Steve, I normally always agree with you, but I'd just like to argue with you on two of your points. One, the NATO reform example. I mean, what NATO adopted over the last 20 years was essentially a policy of three factors. One, civilian control over military, which has led to essentially, in country after country, people, politicians, usually from parliaments, with no military experience, who made a number of disastrous decisions, and one of the most obvious is in Germany. A whole series of them. Secondly was to get rid of large force structure and slim down to minimum size to save money. And that happened not only in Western Europe, but Eastern Europe. To the point that the Ukrainian ground forces today are larger than about 3 or 4 major. You can take Poland, Germany, and the Benelux, and German and Ukrainian forces are superior to them, and certainly in numbers. And the third was to go light, so that we could people could have foreign deployment. You know, I don't disagree with you at all that modern technology is out there, but still, you achieve invasions of other people's lands by armored forces. And one looks in vain, and for example, the Baltics, where you can't find a main battle tank. I think the Germans had a big debate last year about between their general staff and the defense minister. The general staff said we have 180 main battle tanks, and the defense minister said we have 220, and the difference was they had those extra 40, they just didn't have any manpower or active force to supply them or operate them. A German army with 180 tanks. Those three things, I think, are a terrible example for Ukraine. Having people who are militarily incompetent, pushing to save money, and going to a truly flawed model in terms of a continental power. Now, one other thing, in terms of holding the Israeli example. Israel gets $3 billion a year in United States military assistance plus an $8 billion loan guarantee. You give that to Ukraine, and hell yeah, they can be exemplar. Israel is not doing it by itself, and it is a charade to say that it is. They are doing it because their ability, including having technology that they can go around and then turn and sell to a number of other people, sometimes showing up in Russian, for example, the four-post UAV with American ITAR-controlled parts flying over Ukraine and targeting Ukrainian forces. So I love you, and I generally agree. I just thought that using those two examples were overstated and in a way dangerous. But I'd love to argue with you.
We probably would love to argue with each other, but let me get back to NATO. First of all, you're absolutely right about NATO after 1989. However, starting in 2014, the light bulb gradually came on, and we've begun to see changes in NATO. That's the NATO I'm talking about now, not where they had these disastrous situations. My former colleague at the Army War College, Thomas Young, has written an excellent book on, quote, what military reform has been in Eastern Europe. Not one Eastern European country can defend itself, thanks to those reforms. And they're exactly the kinds of things you talked about, but also their own failure to overcome Soviet legacy mentalities and so forth. However, the Russians have done us a favor. They awoke us from what Kant called our dogmatic slumbers, and forced us to understand that theater conventional scale war is back in business. And gradually, far too slowly, and I'm critical of all this, NATO is learning what it needs to do. And I think if we had stronger leadership in Europe and in Washington, we would be able to get the alliance to function cohesively, to upgrade its conventional capabilities along the lines you've written and I've written and other people have to meet the Russian threat. As for Israel, yes, they've gotten the aid from the United States in the last 20, 30 years, but before that they weren't getting that. That's only starting in the 80s. Where they,
No, 73 war.
73 war, okay. But what about 56 and 67? They were on their own. So, also, it's not only a question that somebody's writing them checks and giving them money. It's what you do with the money. Now, I am afraid that if we gave Ukraine that kind of money today, a lot of it would disappear, which is why you need strong control over the armed forces. Democratic, I preface it by democratic. I realize that the risk is of having incompetent civilians running the military. But there's the only answer to this, because, the military running the military is not going to be a solution. And you and I know that. The only answer to this is that people like myself and others in the building who are involved in military education educate our military properly and educate their militaries properly. We made a terribly wrong decision, Europe made a terribly wrong decision a generation ago, for which we are still paying the price. But we need to keep at it. And we have to understand that, like as Plato said, that we have not seen the end of war.
So you have a comment to weigh in? You're going to pass.
Well, it's too broad a topic. I can also discuss this to great lenses. As I said, about this paper that now Ukraine has a real enemy. And 10 years ago in US-Ukrainian Research Institute. I tried to find some answers on your question. How Ukraine can do the war? Because after 3 years as a first deputy, first tenure in the ministry, I was not sure that Ukraine can successfully fight Russians. And for different reasons, one of those was spirit of average Ukrainian, whether it is from Lviv or from Yalta or from Donetsk, so they were very different. It's visible. And I tried to find the answer whether we will fight or not. And frankly, I couldn't find the good answer. I hesitated then to say that if we fight Russia, we're gonna lose some losses. Unfortunately, it is materialized. Ukraine, unlike Israel, is not yet cohesion, if it's correct word, society, and it means a lot. And this is in terms of what Steve says, it's not only about weapons. According to Ukrainian regulations, one of the key categories of combat readiness is morale. Probably is for any military. But fighting war with Russians, morale is equally important for modern weapons. If we're not careful with keeping morale, we're going to lose even more territories and people. But this is probably not for this for this one.
Thank you. First, the gentleman all the way at the back.
Michael, inside the American veterans. Can you get the mic? I think you're saying Mike. I could hardly hear you. Ukrainian American veterans, Michael Hitzak, U.S. Army retired lieutenant colonel. One of the big things that I think we don't know how to tackle, because the Ukrainians don't know how to tackle, is defense procurement. I have a feeling that Dr. Carver is going to speak about that later, but Ukrobomprom, it's a Soviet legacy system, and those littoral ships that are sitting on a dock here, it took President Poroshenko to get those ships, at least the crews over here, to get trained. But the U.S. has also offered Ukraine Oliver Hazard Perry guided missile frigates. If Ukraine doesn't wake up, they're going to miss, because a mosquito navy is just that, a mosquito navy. But they can't treat their land forces the same way. I've run into several of the students now from the Ukrainian Armed Forces that are going to National War College, Command General Staff College, the same thing that we went through. And even at the Command General Staff College, which prepares our officers for field-grade assignments, we already talk about echelons above reality. So what we're seeing right now with the Russians is brigade level, command and control, and they're using battalion tactical groups. We've studied that. The Armor magazine, the Armor community has studied it. What Ukraine needs is both on the military side to start working on not only their logistics, but their command control and communication, but they need the civilian side to do a serious, I mean, Ukrobomprom cannot, a Soviet legacy system like that cannot exist. What would you suggest? How do we start? Do we start on the civilian side, or do we start on the military side and the civilian side at the same time?
I'm going to take one more question, collect another question. Could we have the microphone right here in front, please?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Jim Green. I have a long association with Ukraine security issues and NATO. And the discussion here reminds me of a little bit of deja vu when I ran the NATO liaison office. The big sort of conflict in terms of reform and organization was between the existing resources of the Ukrainian armed forces, which were by and large Soviet legacy, in terms of both material and doctrine, and reform, which was often put as NATO standards, in a way which I found to be unhelpful. It became a slogan or a checklist. But what it really is about, what NATO standards are about, is ways of fighting and winning wars. And changing the way that an armed forces fights and wins wars. In 2014, a third element came into this equation. Truly amazing. What I think those of us, I think the West severely underappreciates the extent to which, Stephen, Ukraine, like Israel, mobilized its society, went from having less than 2,000 combat-ready forces in the entire country to having tens of thousands of forces, many of them civilian, a volunteer logistics system, just a tremendous mobilization of societal support for defense. And we underestimate the extent to which this changed the equation for Russia and for the potential of invasion. Today, to me, when I hear discussion about new weapons programs, for example, is the key, it strikes me that the two things that are missing is, one, looking at these resources, whether it's NATO standards or this civilian energy, as a means of winning war, that the principal question isn't reform, it's a strategy for conflict. And the second being that this energy expressed in the volunteer movement and in the civilian movement has to a large extent dissipated and not been effectively brought into the system and used. In effect, the impression from the outside, and I would be delighted to be wrong, is that despite a lot of improved experience, a lot of improved techniques, a lot of operational experience, that the Soviet approach overall to warfare and to organization is at the core. That hasn't changed. There hasn't been a commitment to, at very senior levels, to look beyond what people learned at Frunze. So that's a question to kind of to put out. One is, how does this question refocus on fighting and winning wars and the role of NATO and the mobilization to do that? Because I think a lot of what I hear is, oh, we'd love to have NATO membership or NATO standards, we'd love to have more mobilization and the volunteers, but look, we really need to win the war, and we do that the old way. I have another very small question. This is a political military question. Russia has shown itself to be very effective at leveraging negotiations to operational military advantage. They did it for Minsk I, they did it for Minsk II. In both cases, they gained temporary advantage, and they used it to devastating effect. Is there in place in Ukraine and in our own capitals a military assessment of the current negotiations and the current risks of withdrawal, the current movements, to prevent that from happening a third time?
And just a quick question.
Yeah, because I don't want to break the regime myself. But the question is, as a follow-up on both what Mike and James brought up, and that is that we've been talking about the old Soviet system, but I wanted to ask a very direct question to both. And that is that I saw at Kiev Polytechnic Institute, and then I saw it again when
probably right about Putin, because if you look at the overall situation of Russian science, it's in very bad shape. Given the human capital and the sort of the legacy of what Soviet science, Russian science was before that, that's pretty sad, pretty shocking. We have cases where former Soviet allies or republics like Estonia have completely thrown out the entire model and achieved some really impressive technological cases. But it gets back to the kind of case he's here. He's going to build up IAI. I mean, the world famous now, and a whole defense sector along with it and so on. Yes, with American aid, as Phil said, but again, the aid is used constructively. I mean, this gets back to the question, if I wrote you the check, I mean, if you submitted the proposal, we went through the usual process, and I said, oh, this is great, I wrote you the check, would the products actually come out? Not so sure. But, you know, we have private ways of doing this through the National Academy of Sciences and other groups and so on, that might get to really push Ukraine's economy altogether, not just the military sector, the whole S&T sector. To get to the other questions, yes, the whole idea of NATO standard is not just to have a, you know, we did a checklist, but to be able to field credible war-winning capabilities. But you are also right that they have not yet internalized the need to get out of the entire Soviet system lock, stock, and barrel. You know, the Russians have made significant military reforms. If you go back and look at what they've done in the last 10 to 20 years. I mean, this is not through a Soviet army. It's a very different kind of army. Its thinking is different in many ways, not all. But it's different. The Ukrainians still haven't done that despite the fact of war. And it is necessary to keep that going. And third, I mean, let's be honest, we live in an age of mediocre international political leadership, without naming names. Because it's not just one country. Boris Johnson is not Winston Churchill. He may think so in his dreams, but there's a rather big difference between them. And Macron certainly is not de Gaulle. And, you know, whether you like Angela Merkel or not, she's leaving. I mean, she's a strong figure, but she's leaving. And things are not good in Germany, domestically. If you talk to people who live there and you read the news. So, that's a fundamental problem. We don't even have to discuss our own crisis, which throws a glaring light on strategic incompetence of a very high degree. But what is necessary is somehow that Ukraine keep moving forward on its own. I think that the morale is better than you do, although I don't think it's as good as it should be or could have been given what we saw 5 years ago. But morale alone and mobilization capability is not enough. I would suggest, and I have an article coming out that says this, that one way we can help Ukraine, and for that matter all of Eastern Europe and NATO, is by going back to something that FDR did 80 years ago, called Lend-Lease. The great operational problem the U.S. faces today is getting access to Eastern Europe. You talk to people like General Hodges, former commander of Budjeryn and others, and the problem is getting troops from Bremerhaven or Amsterdam or Le Havre or whatever port it is to the front. The infrastructure in Europe is awful for this purpose, for lots of reasons we don't have time to go into. So we have a problem getting access. The East European governments as a whole, Ukraine is not alone in this, have a major problem with operations, with reform and so on, access to modern technology and so forth. So let us lend them weapons we no longer need. Oliver Harry frigates, for example. In return for access to naval bases in Ukraine. That would certainly get the Russians' attention very quickly. It would certainly, same thing could be done in Eastern Europe in order to improve the infrastructure. Because as we pay them for the, you know, what we're leasing from them, they could use that money to build the infrastructure, rail, air, ground, sea, and so on, and telecommunications. That would actually strengthen East Europe economically and and so on. There are energy things that we can do too. I'm writing on that as well. But you see anybody in town with that kind of strategic vision? And believe me, I don't have any influence on this administration. So.
Starting from Ukroboronprom, there's a progress. In time of President Yanukovych, Ukroboronprom was just the instrument instrument to siphon budgetary money. In terms of President Poroshenko, it was satisfactory instrument to support the military. Now there is a hope at least that this instrument would be not just satisfactory but maybe a good one if transformed and improved. The good news, as I said in my presentation, that in Ukraine, Ukroboronprom is maybe about 40% of defense orders. About 60% is private and Ukrokosmos suppliers of weapons. But going further to sincerity of Ukrainian cooperation with NATO, with Ukroboronprom, and with other things, the simple answer we have seen recently on the 24th of August in Kyiv, when we had two parades. One is official governmental and another is unofficial. It means that in Ukraine currently we have two states. One is official state, where primary beneficiaries are wealthy people like Akhmetov, Kolomoisky, Pinchuk, and others, who have their political parties, who have businesses, and they benefit more or less primarily from getting access to budgets. And we have growing civil society, veteran society, elections of the current president is also a reflection of that, who are not similar to 20 years old oligarch system. And whatever we take, let's take NATO. NATO's access is not about the military strength. NATO access is about political decisions. Ukrainian political parties, whatever they say, but their financial supporters, I don't believe they like the idea of Ukraine being in NATO, because it will mean they will lose a lot of their influence. So it will be slow, I hope it will be progressive change of equation between currently oligarchic political system in Ukraine, which I think is slowly losing grounds, and strengthening political forces which are less dependent from Pinchuk money, from Kolomoisky money, or other tycoons' money, and then we'll forget about Ukroboronprom, Svenarchukyi, and all of these things which are not important in themselves. They are just reflection of the system we have.